The Ottawa Senators came into Winnipeg sporting an 8-2 record in their last 10, and the Jets still came away with a big 2 points. Find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, the Jets this past weekend had a big game against the Ottawa Senators, and I saw some pre-game buzz from folks suggesting that Ottawa wasn't going to be that hard and that they wouldn't be that big of an opponent and, certainly not a team to really worry about. But having seen how Ottawa has played their last month or so, and the fact that they were finally starting to get some real saves, I was not so confident. I thought that this would be a tough game. I thought it would take a really impressive effort from the Jets. And you know what? For the most part, I think Winnipeg did pretty well. There were some moments where I think things got a little shaky, but we'll dive into how and why in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to say thanks again for listening and making Locked On your first listen of the day, and let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $250 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, coming into this game, the Jets were playing a tough Ottawa team, and, the Sens have a big thing that Winnipeg does not, and that is skating speed. That tends to be one of the biggest differences between Winnipeg and a lot of the teams that really gives them absolute fits, right? The Sens also have very good offensive production up and down their lineup, but for the Jets, this was going to have to be a game in which Winnipeg really needed to stay disciplined and avoid making really big mental gaffes. And for the most part, the Jets generally did. Winnipeg, especially through the first couple of periods, played a really good 5v5 game. And the only real separating gap here was that the Jets took a couple of penalties. The double minor against Vilardi, I didn't really love. I was kind of surprised that we got a double minor for that, but decision making from the referees aside, the Jets at even strength really were pretty fine. They outcreated Ottawa at even strength. I thought, the top line looked pretty good, and it was really just the PK that was a problem. It was Ottawa's only goals in the night. They scored 2, and, the PK on both times was not great. Logan Stanley, again, brought into the lineup to be a PKer, and again, he's just not that guy. Watching him on one of the earlier goals, trying to cut the cross slot pass off, doing whatever it is that he does, didn't really work. And that's been a pretty consistent theme. So at some point, the Jets coaching staff is going to have to either acknowledge that he's not really good at the PK, or I guess they'll just keep using him there and seeing what happens. So, yeah. Classic Jets PK stuff. A little bit disconcerting that the PK has kind of fallen off this much. I really thought, at the start of the year it was pretty good, but recently, past month and a half or so, it's definitely diving back towards the bottom of the league. We're now around 20th or so in PK percentage, so not ideal, but thankfully the Jets' power play is still great. That you never really have to worry about. And, the power play did get a beautiful goal from Gabriel Vilardi on the doorstop. This one courtesy of some nice passing from Connor and Ehlers. And the top line really took care of most of the rest, right? Kyle Connor, after, the Sens power play goes up a couple of goals, he gets the Jets on the board off of a great sequence with Scheifele. And then Scheifele himself later on, in the middle of a line change, Ehlers was going off the ice and, went along the walls. All the Sens' attentions kind of got drawn to that area where the puck was, and Ehlers just sort of backhanded a beautiful feed up to a darting Scheifele up the middle, cut right through the Sens' defense, and scored a great backhanded goal against Sogard. Absolutely peach of a goal, great game tire, and then the Jets went into the third period, got that power play goal, and then Ehlers iced it on a really nice stretch pass from Stanley, who found him on the right wall, right side, right half wall, near the benches, and Ehlers just sort of kind of glided between a couple of defenders, and for some reason, Ottawa gave him a lot of time and space to shoot, and he did not miss. Great to see Ehlers getting on the board. Finally, Stanley giving you a good pass. It's frustrating because like Stanley does actually make some good stretch passes from time to time. It's just that it doesn't really outweigh a lot of the other issues that he has. I think it wouldn't be as much of a problem to play him if he was consistently giving you good value, but he just doesn't. So he was actually asked to be on the second pairing with Pionk. Yeah, you can probably guess how that went. Playing 20 minutes of Logan Stanley a night is a little bit worrying, but for the most part, the Jets ended up unscathed. Hellebuyck putting up another ridiculous performance, a 943 on the evening. And like I said, the Jets at even strength were generally pretty good. The only time things really, really got hairy that wasn't on the PK was when Ottawa pulled their goalie. That 6-on-5 was very scary. The Jets were actually very fortunate that they didn't concede. So, close game. But ultimately, the Jets prevailed, and I would say that they deserve the win. Barring a couple of really scary moments, Winnipeg was generally the better team. And you know what? You take it, right? And like I said, I think the Sens team is probably one of the better ones that they've faced the last couple of weeks. Even compared to like Toronto and Minnesota, Ottawa has been really pretty close to the Leafs level. In fact, I would argue that their offense might be even a little more consistent. They just went into Minnesota tonight and ended up really embarrassing the Wild on the road. After having a tough game last night, they come in tonight. They beat Minnesota and really beat the brakes off of them, despite it being consecutive nights of hockey. I think it really just adds to the prestige of what the Jets did in the previous outing on Saturday. So huge win, a great 2 points. I think Winnipeg can be very happy with this game. I think the Sens are no longer the pushover that they were at the start of the year. They're starting to get some real saves. They are a little, leaky right now thanks to no Ullmark, but I would expect them to be a potential playoff team this year. And if they get into the postseason, they're going to be a real handful in the eastern side of the bracket. So, the Jets really should take some comfort in the quality of this win. Big victory, nice home game. And, it was great to see the top line putting together another performance. I do hope that that's indicative of what we can see from this top line going forward. One thing that the first line has often struggled with is that they'll play pretty well against bad teams, but then you get these quality opponents and they sort of go missing. That wasn't the case here. They actually played a pretty nice game. They created some great chances. And I hope that that's the version of this top line that sticks around, because I can see why the coaching staff wants to make it work. And you see games like this, and very clearly they have the talent to make it work. It's just, can you do it while being pressured and forced into corners, making board plays, and facing a heavier forecheck? And so far, the Jets did a pretty good job. Ottawa kind of got the first step on a lot of Jet skaters, but Winnipeg still held true. Connor Hellebuyck did his thing. And, just a win that you can be pretty happy about. So, great victory, a nice setup for what is going to be an intense, probably a feverish game against Nashville. The Predators aren't a particularly great opponent, but given, how the Jets have played in their previous game against Nashville, it's hard to take anything for granted, right? This is a Preds team that's desperate, looking to make a statement, and walking into Winnipeg and coming away with 2 points certainly would count. But amidst all of that, I did want to touch on something before we get to the Preds game that is perhaps a little bit of a pressing question, one that we haven't really discussed in a while, but it's what you do with Ehlers, right? He's not going to get traded this season, but, coming into the offseason, that remains a huge question. And with Ehlers now putting up like a 3-point game last night and generally having a very strong season the past few weeks once he's been, back to full health, it makes it a very tricky proposition to figure out how Winnipeg and Ehlers are going to resolve their previous disputes. We'll chat about that in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subs you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That's definitely happened to me, whether it's music or video streaming. I've had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subs, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subs, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of 500 million in canceled subs, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, I watch a lot of sports, and so making sure that I'm not double paying for stuff is really important. Rocket Money helped me do that, and it can help you too. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting about, the recent run of form for the Jets. Things have been going pretty well. Big win over the weekend against Ottawa. Tonight's game is going to be a tough one against the Preds. And one guy who's probably going to be at the middle of all of this is Nikolai Ehlers, who is still without a firm answer on his future status with the Jets. Now, coming into this season, I was fairly convinced Ehlers was going to walk, and I'm still not sure that I feel comfortable with his contract status heading into summer. I think it's a really tough question because Ehlers is, quite frankly, one of our most important players. He's not young anymore, but given the fact that the Jets just don't really have many creative forces like him, and that he is, at this point, a guy who's basically going to be a point-per-game player, one of your most creative forces, an absolute menace on the power play, and really one of your best transition skaters. It's a pretty unique set of skills that Winnipeg just does not have in their reserve ranks. The closest prospect that the Jets have that could be like Ehlers is Lambert. And Lambert, as we saw, still has room for growth and is still kind of working his way up to the NHL. And so it makes his next contract for Ehlers a really big question mark. It's an unknown. And I think you'd rather have two of Ehlers than just one, right? If Lambert becomes a Nikolai Ehlers level player, that's amazing. And honestly, for the Jets, that would be like a best case scenario, especially if he can do it from center. So Ehlers, on the other hand, you have to ask yourself, what is his future with the team? And, really he hasn't answered that question. It's generally been pretty non-committal. And I think if you look at his past couple of seasons, there is a real risk with him, right? He misses a lot of games. He hasn't played a full 82 since 17-18. Some of that, not always within his control. But, the last couple of years, he did actually play 82 last season, my bad. But he's played one 82-game season in like the last 7 or 8 years. So it's been a bit of a rough stretch. And even this year, he's already missed time, right? And you don't have to play like a full 80 games to have, in my opinion, a foolish season. If you hit like the 70-plus game mark, that's pretty good. But Nick's only done that like twice in the last several years since that 18-17 season. So, a lot of this that's missing a fair chunk of time. And so, aside from that, you have to ask yourself, what is his likely trajectory, right? Is his health going to be a problem going forward? With Ehlers, he's 28 and at this point, probably exiting his best years. I think this season, he's kind of been up and down. At his best, Ehlers is constantly creating off the rush, very creative on the power play. He's been a revelation this year. And so I feel like there's a lot of reasons to look at him and really want to re-sign him. But then you kind of look at his deployments, and it's always very interesting. He plays like 14 minutes a night. He's averaging just over 15 this year. And it's kind of like, are you getting the most out of him? Are you making the most of his value? It feels like he's being used in very prime scoring opportunities. So yes, he is over a point per game right now. But I feel like the overall amount of usage and his level of impact on this team has been, in some ways, not as influential at 5v5 as he's been in the years past. And I think part of that might just be that the line that he's on doesn't really fit his skill sets. I still would love to see him play with Connor and Scheifele. With how good Connor has been this year, and with Scheifele, being the smart scorer that he still is, I feel like Ehlers would actually gel really well with their tool sets. I know that they don't want to do that because they want Velarde up there, so at this point, probably a lost cause talking about it. But with Fly, it's a tough question. I think you should extend him, and I think it'd be great to have him back for like 5-ish years. I'm sure he'll want to have 6 or 7 guaranteed. He's at that stage of his career where he really has to swing big for one last deal. I just don't quite know what you would pay him, because you look at his scoring rates the last several years and his deployments, and like the depressed scoring rates with lower ice time kind of puts him in like the 7 million-ish bracket. But I'm sure Ehlers would prefer to get more somewhere. And that's kind of where it's like a two-way street, right? The Jets may feel his injury history and stuff isn't really worth taking a chance on. Ehlers may be looking at this as a great opportunity to go elsewhere and get like top line billing, which I think if he goes to another team, he probably could argue for that. And I think, plenty of squads out there would love to add his creativity and speed. And, there's a whole range of tool sets that he has that just not many players in this league possess. And so I think if he were to hit free agency, he'd be one of the most talked about options on the market. He does seem to like playing in Winnipeg, and I feel like in terms of the personality and fit and his locker room fit, that's all fine and dandy for the most part. I just don't know if, years of perhaps lower time on ice deployments, some level of underutilization, being put on power play 2, all that stuff. What is that going to mean for him personally, right? How will he view that? And I don't know. I can't speak for him. None of us can. Only he can kind of make that decision. I will say that this year I feel like he's been put in prime positions to succeed, generally speaking. So if there's an argument there, I could see maybe this being a positive in favor of him re-signing. But he is playing relatively, middle 6 minutes. 15 minutes or so a night is not huge. I know that he still takes roughly the same amount of shifts as a lot of the other top players on this team. But, I think we all know that for the most part, he tends to short shift. And it does feel like you're maybe not getting as much out of him as you can. He's always kind of been staple to that middle 6, second line sort of role. And so I just don't know how he perceives that, right? If he goes to another team, wouldn't shock me if he's on the first line, 18, 19 minutes a night. He could really start to put up some video game numbers. We're already seeing him doing 30 points in 28 games so far, with one of the lower average time on ice averages for the past couple of seasons that we've seen from him. So what does he do in a prime top line role? He could just absolutely explode and go ballistic, provided his health remains at peak fitness. And we all know that can be a bit of a question mark. So, Ehlers, it is a really tough thing. I tend to lean towards an extension from like a fan perspective. I think organizationally, the Jets would probably like to have Ehlers back, but they may also be willing to just use him as an internal rental and part ways at the end of the season. And maybe Lambert will be ready to step up and fill that void. I don't know. A player as good as Ehlers is not easy to come by. It's not easy to draft either, because, the skilled barrier keeps going up. The number of young players that are really able to have a high level impact in this league is definitely declining. And for the Jets, we know that this team doesn't usually draft in those prime top lotto pick areas where you'd probably find, a much better chance of getting one of these players. And so, it's a really difficult situation. But if you get him back, it would give you a huge top 6 piece returning. Ehlers is obviously one of our most creative outlets, and a guy that, quite frankly, this team just doesn't really have much of in the way of prospect players that could fill in that void. Lambert's probably the closest. Shiberkov doesn't really play an equivalent game. He also doesn't really play a similar game. Walton doesn't. And so you just don't have many Ehlers-like prospects who have the sort of passing creativity and skating that Nick does. And sure, it does come with a fair bit of risk, but I would definitely be in favor of extending. And with the cap going up, the Jets really could afford to give him a decent-sized contract. I don't think you want to pay him like $9 million at all. If you get him at like 7.5 to 8, I think that's probably in the sweet spot. Connor is going to need a huge raise, and that's maybe an even scarier proposition is how much you pay Kyle, right? He's having a career year, obviously having, some of the best hockey we've ever seen from him. He's going to be really expensive in a couple seasons, and I sort of wonder if he finishes his time as a Jet, but who's to say, right? The future is uncertain, and we can only look ahead a couple weeks at a time. So for Ehlers, man, I'm just curious to know where he stands in all of this. Does he feel like he belongs in Winnipeg? Does he feel like the team wants him to stay? He again has generally been non-committal about talking about his contract extension, but if he is willing to come back and he, isn't asking for the sun, moon, and stars, I think you do it. We just don't have many players like him. I don't think it's like signing DeMello where you feel like you are sort of obligated to because your right side is so bad. Ehlers is legitimately a player that most teams would kill to have on their roster. And so I just hope that that's kind of in Winnipeg's wheelhouse too. There's just not many players like him out there. You're going to have a really hard time replacing him internally. And it just makes more sense if he sticks around for at least a little bit longer, especially while this Jets competitive window continues to remain open. But give me your thoughts on this. Would you bring Ehlers back? How much would you pay him and for how long? I'd say I'd feel good about like 7.5 by 5 or 6. That's very low, and I'm pretty sure he's gonna ask for more. But let me know what you think on that in the comments or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. In just a little bit, we are going to preview an upcoming tough game against the Nashville Predators. Yes, they are towards the bottom of the Central. No, that does not mean that they are an easy out, and I think we've all seen that with the previous game the Jets have played. We'll chat about what to expect from the Preds in just a brief moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting a little bit about the upcoming games for the Jets, and obviously tonight's game, going to be a tough one against the Nashville Predators. Their past couple of weeks in December has been all over the place. They've beaten some very good teams. They've lost to some very bad ones. It's hard to really know what Preds team is the real one, but I think we generally have a good sense that this year for them is really looking more towards a lottery pick, but that doesn't mean that you can take them lightly. They're still a very tough opponent. They beat the Jets earlier this season. They are not as, I would say, bad as I think sometimes their rep comes across as, but they're also, vulnerable enough to where, for me, I would expect a Jets victory. I really feel like Winnipeg should come away from this game with 2 points. As of right now, they've got Forsberg, Stamkos, and Marchessault on the first line. Not a lot of speed, but certainly some scoring acumen. I think the Jets' top line, if they do their job, should be able to win this matchup, though. Stamkos has not been good this year. He is scoring lately, and he's been more offensively noticeable, but still not that great overall. And, Forsberg is still Forsberg. He'll probably notch a goal or two here. But as long as the Jets can kind of manage this line and sort of keep them away from Hellebuck, I really don't worry too much. Second line is Leheureux, O'Reilly, and Nyquist. O'Reilly, it seems like they're trying to dump, and Leheureux is, fine enough. Nyquist is underrated, but you look at that as a second line, yeah, the Jets, again, should have a sizable matchup advantage. The third line, a little more challenging. You've got Jankowski, Novak, and Evangelista. Obviously, Novak is one of those guys that I think probably is on a Jets target list somewhere. He's like a really good middle six option, a center that could potentially upgrade on the Mesnikov. And, the past year or so, he has put up some really gaudy numbers for a guy generally playing like third line minutes. So an interesting name to track for sure. Wonder if he ends up in Winnipeg. Don't know how Barry Trotz feels about dealing with the Jets, but would hope that he would be open to it. Your fourth line is Hinostroza, McCarron, and Sissons. Again, Winnipeg should have a line matchup advantage here. We know that doesn't always happen in real time and in motion, but I look at this forward lineup and I really feel like the Jets, if they are as good as they say they are, should have a good time against this team. Defensively, you've got Lauzon and Josie on the first, Shea and Blankenberg on the second, and Wilsby and Shen on your third. This defense, definitely not great. Wilsby has been a huge find for them. He's been fantastic. Josie is still Josie. Everyone else, not so great. This feels like a defense that's maybe 2 steps removed from what the Jets have. So Winnipeg, again, should have a lineup advantage. We'll see. In net, they've got Saros most likely and Annunen backing him up. Saros is a tough one. He's maybe not played up to the usual standards that he has set for himself, but every time I see him, I always feel like when he's really struggling, it's partly because the Preds defense hasn't really given him much support. But I think that this is going to be a big game for him. Nashville past couple of weeks has had a very interesting record. They lost and got shut out by the Preds. They lost to Toronto. They lost to the Sens. And then after a loss to Calgary, they had like a 4 straight game losing streak. They started to turn things around a bit. They beat the Stars. They beat the Rangers. They beat the Kings. They even beat the Carolina Hurricanes and kind of had a couple of losses in there. They did fall to Colorado, to Pittsburgh, and to St. Louis. Of those losses, I would say St. Louis is maybe the lowest quality loss, but they did force overtime against Pittsburgh and just barely came away losing that game. So, this Preds team may be starting to turn things around a bit. And you look at their other losses at the start of the month, they weren't really scoring much at all then. They are starting to put together a few more goal-scoring opportunities now. 3, 4, 5 goals. Not exactly an offensive explosion, but given the start of the season and, maybe even the start of the month, they look a little more dangerous, a little more productive, and I think step by step are trying to at least find their way through the season. It's also not going to be the only time that we see them over the next couple of weeks. They're right back in Winnipeg on January 7th, so should be a fun time, but for tomorrow's or this evening's game, I really feel like this should be 2 points that the Jets come away with. Would put Winnipeg at, already 27 wins, 55 points, league leading, very much an extremely impressive run. Right now, the Jets are really fighting with Vegas for the first spot in the league, right? Vegas is technically number one right now, thanks to the games played. They've got an extra game in hand, and I think they lead by points percentage, but the Jets are right there with them. Would be good if Winnipeg can actually beat Vegas here in a couple of weeks. I am tired of watching the Jets lose to this team, but at least right ahead, the Jets have a big game against Nashville, a couple of Nashville matchups, and then the Jets are going to have a very busy January. So should be a fun start to 2025. I'm looking forward to the rest of the season. I think Winnipeg has a real opportunity to do some damage and to show that this team is more than just the playoff route that it was last season when they got ousted in the first round. I think with a couple of additions, this team's going to be very fun. But for the regular season, this team is definitely built for a lot of success. So expecting 2 points, let me know your score predictions. I've got the Jets winning 4-2. Drop your score thoughts below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with post-game coverage, so see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.